What I'm going to talk to you about today is an organ that also has neurons and neurotransmitters and also processes information. I'm talking about the gut. Now, as someone who studied martial arts and somatic therapies, I'm aware of this very intricate connection between the gut and the brain. We experience our emotionality through our bodies. We're backstage, we're feeling nervous. We experience it in our gut. We're missing someone, we experience it in our heart. So it's this huge interconnected system that we have between mind and body. And that's something that I want to shine a light on today as I talk a little bit about the development of some neurotechnology that I've been involved in specifically to target the brain. So this is it. We think it's all in our head, right? So where is consciousness? Where is this thing that we're looking for? And I'm going to put it to you that we need to start to think of the body as a holistic, interconnected system, especially when we're doing things like developing neurotechnology to help with mental illness, to help with expanding consciousness, neurodegeneration, and brain optimization. But before I start talking about all of that, I just want to give you a little bit of my own background, because I started off my career as a pharmaceutical scientist, and I was mainly looking at drug deposition in the lung, and actually how drug deposition in the lung is influenced by our body's electrostatic charge. And this started me off on a road investigating the effects of electrostatic and electromagnetic charges on the body. And fast forward a few years, and I moved to California, and I start to get involved in structured water technologies. And this is using one of the most predominant electromagnetic fields for humans, certainly as diurnal mammals. I started looking at light and how light structures water. But with my interest in neuroscience, I started thinking about the brain, because the brain is mainly water. So can we perhaps, if we can structure water with light, can we structure the brain using light? And this took me down the whole road of transcranial photobiomodulation. So that is using targeted light of specific wavelengths and frequencies to have an effect on brain function. And I found out actually there are a lot of researchers who are already in this field researching exactly that. So I decided to put myself on a research trial to do some data collection to see for myself if this really was an effective therapy. So this is me in 2018. And this is me volunteering on data collection of a trial using transcranial photobiomodulation for dementia subjects. So I took myself off to the States. I was doing data collection. I saw patients at the start and the end of the study, did data collection all the way through. And it was a double-blind study. And the interesting thing for me, and really what set me off on my whole 5-year journey to develop my own neurotech, was that this really does work. I was looking at people who had fairly progressed dementia symptoms, and they were actually changing. I could very clearly see who was the active group and who was the sham group. There was a difference in reaction time. There was a difference in engagement. There was a difference in the way that people were able to interact with their spouses. And in fact, it wasn't a smooth journey necessarily. There was a degree of resistance to actually getting well. And one of the most interesting reports I had was someone said, I had a brilliant argument with my wife. We were fighting all night, something that hasn't happened for years, because people started to get their opinions back. They started to be able to function as in a way that was much more adaptive. So really, this is what got me hooked on trying to find what is the best way that we can deliver these therapies, particularly red light, to the brain to have the maximum effect. And I think you can see from these clock drawings how profound these effects were over a fairly short period of time. People were actually able to draw clocks, behave rationally, get their life back. So again, I say, this is a study that was carried out in 2018, and I've been on a journey ever since to find out how can I best deliver this therapy. So I'll do a very quick revision of what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about red light therapy. So in transcranial photobiomodulation, that is light therapy that you're using specifically for the brain, we use red and near infrared light. And as a rule of thumb, the longer the wavelength, so the further it is in the infrared spectrum, the deeper the light will go into the brain. And interesting for me, coming from a water science background, is if you go into the longer wavelengths of the infrared range, so above 900 nanometers, then water starts to become a chromophore. So here is my idea about how some of these effects could be due to structuring water in the brain. So several things happen when you shine light onto cells in the body. The main thing is the mitochondria. This is a very simplistic thing, and you may notice I have a little error here in my diagram because I've got two lots of ATP. But actually what you have when you shine light onto mitochondria is production of energy in the form of ATP. You have a release of nitric oxide, which leads to greater blood flow. And you also have reactive oxygen species, which is cell signaling. So this is a lot of things that happen in the body and the brain to have these very profound effects. So why did I start thinking about the gut? Well, one of the things that's interesting with light therapy is that there is a strong systemic component. And what I mean by that is you can shine light onto one part of the body and have an effect on a distal part of the body. And this is something that's exemplified in things like these mouse studies where they're looking at wound healing. If you try and use a mouse model and have a control where you shield the wound on one side of the animal and then shine light onto the other, you still see the healing effect on the other side. And that's because there is a systemic effect of red light in that you can shine light onto one part of the body and it will affect another. Now, this is particularly interesting when you're trying to design a device that targets the brain, because actually it's quite difficult to get light onto the brain. There are a lot of barriers in the way. We have the cranium, we have hair, which can be a big barrier, we have connected tissue. So from the point of view of how do we actually get real photons onto the brain, it may surprise you to know that only between 1% and 3% of the light that you actually put transcranially onto the head potentially gets to the brain. Now, this is useful, and of course we know it works, and there are a lot of studies where they've just used a transcranial delivery method. And I think one of the most interesting things is we can also modulate that signal to entrain brain waves, and that small amount of light seems to be good for that. However, in order to, I think, maximize the therapy to the brain, we need to have a secondary position for the light. And in particular, my favored method is going through the gut. And there are many reasons for that, but mostly because the gut is a second brain. The microbiome is an invisible organ that we have in our lower intestine. And I've said here 90% of cells in our body are bacteria. I think maybe I got a bit overexcited about that, but definitely we are more bacterial or non-human cells than we are human cells in our body. So our microbiome is hugely important for our health. The microbiome is an integral part of the immune system. We have this biodirectional pathway in the body where we have a communication between the gut and the brain via the vagus nerve. And the microbiome are constantly sending signals and metabolites that are going from the gut to the brain. And in fact, more signals are going from the brain to the gut than vice versa. So maybe you're not convinced about the power of the microbiome. I just have this example of a rodent that's affected with a bacteria called Toxoplasma gondii. This particular bacteria will take control of the mice's free will and its reasoning, and it will lose its fear of cats. And in fact, mice with this bug will be attracted to cats. So this is just one example of how, we think that we are making our own decisions, but how many of those decisions are actually other organisms in our body with their own agenda. Okay, so that's all very interesting, but is there any backup studies? And this is an animal study that I looked at. Again, this is 2018. This was a French study. And what you're looking at here is a graph to show these three graphs that are on at the end of this example here. If you shine light onto the gut of a mouse model with Alzheimer's, you get an effect. If you shine light onto the head, you get an effect. If you shine light onto the gut and the brain at the same time, you get a synergistic and enhanced effect. So this is really, one of the main studies that got me on my path for looking at would the best way be to use a dual device system where we can target the gut and the brain at the same time. And this particular group have gone on and they're now looking at a clinical in-human study that backs this data up. So this is a growing field now. This is the field of photobiomics. And it makes sense if we think about it, because bacterial cells are similar in evolutionary structure, at least, to mitochondria. And we know that the bacteria respond to light in very beneficial ways. There's also a lot of data to show that light can inhibit certain detrimental bacteria. And I'm not sure, with a mouse model, you can definitely see a difference before and after looking at the microbiome. In human clinical trials, perhaps we're just affecting the environment where the bacteria grow. But certainly there are groups now, and this paper is written by a group in Australia who are looking into this field, and they're discovering with things like Parkinson's, where you have a very specific profile of bacteria in that condition, that before and after a light therapy intervention, you can actually change the profile of the bacteria that you see in that condition. So we've got pretty convincing evidence, actually, that by targeting the gut using red light, we can change the microbiome profile, and then we also can target the brain with a red light therapy device in order to change the brain waves, and then we have a complete treatment. So this is where I've come to in 5 years. This is kind of the results of all my research, is a dual system device where we can target the head using a device where we can use wavelengths, and the wavelengths can be specifically targeted so that we're structuring the water. So in this device, we have 4 different wavelengths going from red light to target the brain up to 1070 nanometers, 940 and 1070 nanometers. So we're hitting that structured water. And at the same time, we can use a gut device that we can also target that second brain in the gut. So I just want to leave you with this. When you think about yourself, we are more than just individuals. We are actually a holobiont. We are a collection of organisms, hopefully working in harmony together. And by looking after our microbiome and targeting both of our brains at the same time, we're really maximizing our effects of having a therapeutic effect on the gut, on the brain, on our consciousness, and our mental well-being. Thank you very much.